Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. This is our tour through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book and title by title, author by author, period by period. And yesterday we did an oddity, something that deserves to be read but isn't necessarily a literary or historical classic, The Letters of John and Abigail Adams. And today we are doing an author, 2 volumes, and one of the things that author wrote is a classic, and that is this, A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. This is a Penguin Classic for the 1845 version that Douglass wrote originally, that actually endangered his freedom when it was published. It was talked about everywhere. It was a large commercial success, and it was still possible, of course, in 1845. For him to be returned to slavery from his rather comfortable existence in Boston. So he had to flee the country. And 10 years after he wrote this book, 1855, he wrote another book, a variation on this, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. My Bondage and My Freedom was the second book in 1855. And then 30 years after that, in the 1880s, when the world had significantly changed, of course, in the key aspect of life for an ex-slave, he wrote a third volume, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. So in the course of his writing life, he wrote 3 autobiographies. This is the 1845 version with an introduction by Ira Dworkin, and this includes other stuff as well. Douglass made a stab at writing a novel, and that is in here. He also wrote a bunch of famous essays that aren't in any of his autobiographies, but that are included in this volume, including What is the 4th of July to a Slave. But it's the main thing that's in this book is the life of Frederick Douglass, and that is an amazing story. Douglass had an amazing rolling prose style. Fits perfectly with the profuse orotundity of the 19th century. So it definitely reads like a period piece today, but nonetheless powerful, especially when you remember the amazing thing to remember when you're reading this book. If you're an American, you absolutely have to read this book. But when you're reading this book, you're deep inside it, and you have spent time on the page in the company of this author. You're starting to know the turns of his mind. You're starting to know where he will lay his emphasis and where he won't. It's important to remind yourself when you're reading this book that there were plenty of people in the United States when this book was published who didn't view Douglass as a human being at all, viewed him as a livestock animal. The exact same thing as if a cow on a field had written a book. And who would have been happy to snatch him out of the parlors in Boston and the Back Bay and Beacon Hill where he was giving speeches and put him to work. In a field, with no shirt on, being whipped whenever an overseer felt like whipping him. And that would just be his life. And it wouldn't matter. None of the rest of it would matter. His brilliance wouldn't matter. His eloquence wouldn't matter. None of it would matter. He would just be a working body. That's jarring. The further along in this book you go, the more jarring that realization gets. That the first 2 autobiographies that Frederick Douglass wrote, he wrote when a wrong turn in an alleyway could have put him into the hands of a slave finder and sent him exactly to that world in America. A best-selling author, a famous speaker and lecturer in America. I myself prefer the 1845 version, this Penguin Classic, to any other version, to any of the other autobiographies. I shouldn't call them versions of each other, because they're not really. But I prefer the original one to the later 2. And the reason that I mentioned a couple of books is because I have another book. I have the Penguin Portable Frederick Douglass. This one is edited by John Stauffer and Henry Louis Gates Jr. And it has the entirety of this book. It has the entirety of the 1845 Life of Frederick Douglass, and then excerpts from My Life in Bondage, excerpts from The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, a whole bunch of essays and letters, including What is the 4th of July to a Slave, and a whole bunch of other things. Really, another another good example of the fact that I don't need both of these. Because aside from the introduction to this book, which is of course not included here, it fits inside this, so and has all that I need. It's just that sometimes I just want to read this book and not have to find it in an anthology of other stuff. So, and I like both introductions. I like both critical apparatus. So I kept both of them. But either way, your Penguin Today, either one, whichever one you get, your Penguin Today is a strong recommend. Obviously, if you are an American, especially an American after the summer of 2020, and you haven't read Frederick Douglass, you haven't read the book he wrote when he was an ex-slave in 1845, when half the country kept slaves, and when a war was on the horizon about slavery, then you really should. You really, really should. And remember, at periodic points throughout the book, I'm sure you will anyway, what I mentioned, that none of it would have mattered to the overseers in Georgia or South Carolina. None of it would have mattered. It wouldn't have been, oh, well, I'm sorry, we were about to grab you on the streets of Nahant, but then then we recognized you, Mr. Douglass, and so we won't. None of that would have mattered. He would have been broken, beaten, whipped, humiliated, given a new name, and sent back into the fields. Despite anything, just jarring, absolutely jarring. But in addition to your Penguin Classic, which of course is a recommend, I also want to give you a Penguin adjacent recommendation because I cannot recommend this thing highly enough. This is David Blight. This is his biography of Frederick Douglass from a few years ago. That I was blown away. I remember seeing advance word of this thing, and I'd read a couple of other Frederick Douglass biographies, and I was thinking, well, as in so many cases in Penguin Classics, the gold standard here, the bar to clear, is not going to be another biography of Frederick Douglass. It's going to be Douglass's own books. Are you going to be able to bring something to the table other than what he does? His own books, especially I think that 1945 autobiography, are overwhelmingly powerful. They're overwhelmingly eloquent. What can a biographer do in the company of such things? And it turns out there's a lot that a biographer can do, and this is great. This is a perfect example of why I love biography so much, because you can get a definitive new work on a subject on a regular basis. It happens regularly. As archives open up, as evidence shifts around, as societal ideas change and shift. As all of that happens, suddenly new biographies can churn to the surface and do wonders, and this book does. So I wanted to recommend it in addition to whichever of these two Penguins you want to get in terms of reading about Frederick Douglass. I mean, the raw outlines of his life are given very well in the introduction to this book, but David Blight goes into a great deal more detail and is really, really powerful and readable throughout. So there you go. That's your Penguin Classic for today. It's Frederick Douglass, and we'll see if we stick around in the 19th century tomorrow. I'm not looking ahead, so I don't know, but we'll resume. We'll find out together tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.